Hello, fifth graders. We're going to be talking today about the Pacific Northwest region and Southwest region. So there were tribes, many tribes in both of these areas, and there are a lot of similarities between their cultures because of where they lived. So what I want you to understand today is that Native cultures were really affected by their environment. So, what the climate was like, what kind of weather they had, if it was hot and dry, or was there a lot of rain, were there mountains, were they close to the ocean? Those things really affected their culture. So, we're going to be um, doing some um, comparing today. So, we're going to be looking at these two different regions, parts of the United States, and we're going to be um, comparing them side by side. So the Pacific Northwest region is this area right here where we live. And the Southwest region is this area. I'm just changing my pen now. This area in the southwestern United States. And those are really different parts of the country. And so they were affected really differently by their environment. So the Pacific Northwest region up here, we can call that also the PNW, is the area between the Pacific Ocean and the Cascade Mountains. And that's exactly where we live. And it went from like Oregon and Washington all the way up to British Columbia, which is Canada, all along the ocean. So in this area, we have a mild climate. That means it doesn't get super, super cold in the winter. It doesn't get super, super hot in the summer. And we have lots of forests. And you guys know, because you live here, you know that we have lots of rain. And so that affects that is affected by our climate, and that affects the homes that Pacific Northwest tribes lived in. So most people in this area lived in houses called longhouses. And they would live on the beaches because they really depended a lot on animals that came from the ocean for their food. So a big part of their culture was and is still hunting for whales as well as salmon. There are some places further north where some tribes may have also hunted for seals, but that's mostly a little bit further north. So the food they ate was connected to the food that was available to them. The type of place where they ended up living had to do with where food was available for them, and also the materials that were available to them. So cedar trees were very important and are still important to Pacific Northwest tribes. They use cedar trees to make their houses, so those long houses. Long houses look kind of like a long cabin. And they used to have many families living in a long house because they were really big. And having a lot of people living in a space together also helped keep them warmer. They were able to make clothing out of cedar trees, out of the bark, because the bark is kind of soft. So if you rip the bark off, it makes kind of like almost like threads that you can make clothing out of. They used cedar trees to make canoes as well. And so the canoes were really important because they allowed them to hunt in the ocean. Oops, I'm going to make a blue ocean. They allowed them to hunt in the ocean for whales and salmon. And obviously that was a really important part of their culture. They also use cedar trees to make totem poles. Now, totem poles are really important cultural icons, and they were a really important way to tell stories about their tribe's history and origin stories, like we were talking about last week. So if you look at all of these things, these are just a few elements of the cultures in the Pacific Northwest. They were really affected by where they live, because they lived in a place that was that had a lot of trees, that was by the ocean, and so they developed elements of their culture based on cedar trees and whales and salmon, and those are the kinds of things that show up in their stories as well. Now we're going to look at Southwest cultures. And so this is a very different region of the United States. It was hot and dry there, so they don't get a lot of rain. And in most of that area, there are high mesas. Mesa is the Spanish word for table. And so a mesa is kind of like a big hill, but it's flat on the top. But they're kind of high up in elevation. So often not a lot of things grow there. And they're not like big trees like there are in the Pacific Northwest. And so there's not a lot of shade. One place where there was shade was in the canyons. And so canyons became a really important part of a lot of these cultures and end up being really sacred spaces for a lot of tribes. Some of these tribes were also nomads, which means that they moved from place to place. So as the weather changed in the year, maybe it made sense to live in different areas. So remember I said that there wasn't a lot of shade for them, and it was really hot and dry. So a lot of tribes developed a kind of house that was underground. This is called a kiva. And this made a lot of sense because if you dig into the ground is a lot cooler than the surface temperature. And so it would be not quite so hot underground in these kivas. And they would cover them up and live basically in these holes underground. And some tribes made clay houses because that's the material that they had. So they could make things out of clay. They had some trees, so they were able to make some things out of wood, but not nearly as many as the Pacific Northwest. There are also more wildfires in that area, so making a house entirely out of wood maybe wouldn't be the best option for them. So since there was a lot of clay, a lot of clay in the Southwest, pottery is a very important part of Southwest cultures. So they often make really beautiful artwork on pottery. Sometimes that artwork tells stories and myths from their culture. Because that was the material that they had, they made art out of pottery. The Pacific Northwest people made art out of cedar trees because they had a lot of cedar trees and they were very important to them. The people in the Southwest had a lot of clay, sand, and so they used that to make pottery for their artwork. One of the ways that the Southwest people were able to be successful is they figured out how to grow crops using irrigation. So irrigation is when you grow crops in an area that usually doesn't have enough rain to grow crops, and so you have to figure out how to get extra water to that place. And so they were able to use water in a really clever way so that they could still grow crops even though it was hot and dry there. Animals were also scarce. So if you think about a desert, that's where they were, in a desert. There just aren't as many animals living there because it's a really harsh place to live. And so they didn't eat nearly as many animals as the people in the Pacific Northwest region. We talked about how they mostly ate whales and salmon. They also ate things like berries and other plants, but they mostly ate animals for their food. And so the Southwest cultures traditionally did not eat as many animals, but ate a lot more plants. So their diet, the food they ate, it was really connected to where they lived based on what was available for them, what they could grow. Their art was affected by their environment because the Southwest people had a lot of clay. They could use that to make pottery. And the Pacific Northwest people had a lot of cedar trees, and they used that to create art in totem poles and all kinds of other things. Their canoes also were really beautiful, had really beautiful paintings on them and things like that. So their canoes you could think of as art as well. And then their houses, of course, were also connected with where they lived. So a longhouse made sense in the Pacific Northwest because they needed a lot of shelter. They needed a big place where lots of people could live so that they could keep it warm. And in the Southwest, it made sense to build kivas underground where it was a little bit cooler, or clay houses that would be protected from fire and from heat. And those were the materials that they had. So when you do your writing today, remember what I talked about, how each of these cultures are connected to their environment. When I say the word environment, I mean the climate, what the land was like. So remember, climate is it hot and dry? Is it cold and wet? And what resources were available to them. So the resources would be things like the cedar trees and the animals from the ocean, or clay and the kind of crops that they had. Um, those are all things that are part of the environment. And so you're going to be thinking about how their environment, all of those things I just mentioned, are connected to their culture. So their culture has to do with what kind of art they made, and what kinds of stories they developed, and what kinds of houses they made, and things like that.